Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, wrapped in a pandemic for more than a year now, and wrapped in turmoil here in the United States in particular, as violence erupted this week around, in a predicted spasm, really, related to the fictions that were spread by the president around the election. And we saw how powerful the mix of social media and divisive politics, and I guess the ability to travel to get people to one place in one time could imperil institutions that this country has built over and relied on for 200 plus years. Today on Sustain What, which is normally focused on pandemic resilience, climate policy, and the like, we're going to dive in on the social climate around this particular event and peel back the layers to look at the drivers and to look at what we can do realistically going forward from here. Some great discussants coming on. I'm adding another one here. We have, and one more is coming. I'm Andy Revkin. I'm at the Earth Institute at Columbia University, where I run a nascent project on sustainability and communication. I'm in the Hudson Valley Annex, my little office here in my home in the Hudson Valley. And I'm here with Dana Fisher, who's a professor of sociology at the University of Maryland and author of a couple of books that are highly relevant. You'll learn more about her and the books and her view of the issues here shortly. And also Beth Fisher-Yoshida, who is here at the Earth Institute and affiliated projects. And you'll learn more about Beth in a second. I just wanted to show you a little clip that Bloomberg posted showing the differential reaction of authorities to these two recent disruptions, the racial uprising for racial justice this past year and what happened here in Washington this week. And you can see, as everyone I'm sure out there has noted, there was a stark difference in how authorities treated these two situations. Bloomberg folks in their video group have done a bit of a compare and contrast visuals here. This is only one of the troubling elements around what's happened, and we're going to discuss all of this now. So thank you. If Dana and Beth, you can unmute if you're muted. It's great to have you both here.
Thank you.
And let's just start. Let's just start with the basics. And we'll get in a little bit more on your backgrounds and where they're relevant. How are you doing, first of all, and where in the world are you each of you right now? Dana, maybe first.
I'm doing okay. It's been very busy because I study protest and activism, so it's been quite the week. I'm based in Maryland, right 300 feet from the District of Columbia. So I'm right now in my house.
Yeah.
And Beth?
Yeah, I'm doing well too. I'm actually located in New Jersey. So just across the river from Columbia University.
And just to describe briefly your background, Beth, you're involved with two of my favorite projects here, at least two. When I came to Columbia, one of the first things I stumbled on was the Difficult Conversations Laboratory that Peter Coleman and others had developed, and partially Teachers College and this advanced consortium. And in the climate context alone, I said, boy, we need more of that in what I do in the context of sustainability and communication. I think we all, historically, I was a journalist, right? So I think about communication, impact, I think just tell a better story. But when we dive into these arenas that Dana and you are involved with, you realize that telling a better story has no meaning if no one's listening, or if they're listening with a completely different perception of the facts. And the more sociologists I've talked to, the more sobered I've gotten over all of these questions. So Beth, just a thumbnail sketch of what you do and how that relates to what we're seeing. And then Dana.
Thanks. I work in the area of negotiation and conflict resolution. A lot of it has to do with storytelling or narrative and narrative transformation to show social transformation and how to transform. I direct the negotiation and conflict resolution master's program at Columbia University. And so teach a lot of ways to students and of all different ages and backgrounds about different ways of understanding what's going on, because things are much more layered and complex than we think they are. And so what are the tools you can use to help develop those different perspectives? And I think one of the things we're seeing now is that it doesn't only matter how well you tell a story, because people hear that story according to their frame and their own narrative, and they pick up what reinforces what they already believe and don't necessarily change unless there's an intention to hear things differently and to change. So that's just a little bit about my background.
Building a space where that reflection is possible.
Building the space for reflection, understanding your own self, and then having that space to understand other people and understanding who you are in relation to those other people. And then, of course, emotions and fear and all of that shape how we hear things as well. And I think when we start to talk about what happened this week, we can see the fear that drives a lot of people to do what they did, and also how people respond to what was done. So
amazing. And Dana, I'm just showing you have a book out recently, but you for a long time have been focused on protest from different sides of the social landscape, and your work is extremely relevant to what's going on. Just give your own quick sketch of what's your lens when you're looking at your screen and seeing what's erupting, or if you happen to be down in DC anytime this past week.
So I study democracy, civic participation, activism, protest, and actually my work on protest started around climate, and I continue to do a lot of work around climate activism, climate protest. The book American Resistance included all sorts of left-leaning activism that emerged after the election of Donald Trump, and it traces the people in the streets into people resisting back in their communities and in congressional districts. But I also study the ways, this full spectrum of activism and engagement. And so I've been watching as we've seen increasing confrontation. I actually wrote in Time magazine a year ago that I predicted that violence would erupt when Trump won the re-election. So I was wrong. But nonetheless, a lot of the reasons why I suggested that actually were true, unfortunately. The other thing I would say is that I do straddle two different areas, because I study this activism component and civic participation component, but I also study climate policy making particularly. And so I've, for many years now, been studying echo chambers in climate politics. Oh, look, there it is. See, yeah. I asked them if they would let me revise it, after.
Oh, you should do an update, yeah.
Well, they didn't want to. I ended up publishing something similar instead elsewhere. So, and I have a new piece that's actually coming out that's going to be called something like, Where Does the Insurgency Go Now?
Interesting.
Which I'm happy to talk about. But one thing I was just going to say is I've done this work on echo chambers around climate politics, where we actually trace the way that climate denialism has affected policy elites in terms of understanding how information diffusion is channeled and amplified and distorts science when we talk to policy elites. And we've also looked at the role that social media plays. And while climate is not the central thing that has really been pushing for polarization right now in America, we can see the way that whole process of echo chambers and kind of siloing of conversations among people based on their ideology has really driven the narrative and driven what we're seeing happening right now, and what's going to continue to happen, unfortunately.
That issue of how information moves, and again, I guess who are the deciders, or the power elites, as you say, is so important. And some of the other social scientists I've talked to, just briefly on the climate front, like Robert Bruhl and Carrie Norgard, did a piece a year ago on social inertia. That was really profoundly impactful for me, because it said, if you're an activist, even, you have this, if you run up against, if the true scope of what the change would need to happen is revealed to you, it can be very paralytic. It's just like then you get on a plane and still go to Washington, for example, burning CO2, emitting CO2 as part of your activism. And I don't know, it feels like a really tough challenge. And that's climate. And the pandemic has the same characteristics. Our political polarization right now is so interesting too. interesting is probably the wrong word. So
It's
Beth,
a nice word though.
yeah, it's a way to look at it that implies there are pathways to take. And what I try to do on this show is push us toward pathways. What would we do? So circling back to this situation, in the context of your activism expertise, Dana, like put yourself in the heads of these activists who were.
Well, so if you're talking about the people who were at the Capitol this week, I'm pushing back and suggesting that everybody calls them insurgents, which is actually the way that people are talking about in the media. Because these people, while they were able to apply for and be granted permits to hold a peaceful rally, they actually had permits for 2 peaceful rallies in Washington, D.C. They were neither peaceful nor were they following the actual rules of the permits. And actually, I did an event with somebody, a spokesperson from the National Park Service on NPR earlier this week. We were specifically talking about the fact that they were not actually following the rules, but these people basically came claiming they were there to be peaceful. And then there was all these rumors already on social media and very clear indications. These people were coming specifically to break into the Capitol and basically hold an insurgency. And the shocking thing is that the Capitol Police was so ill prepared and behaved in such a remarkable way with regard to these, right radical folks, in contrast to, as you showed with that great Bloomberg clip. But we also could see, to go back to climate, we actually can see similar contrasts with the way that the police have dealt with climate protesters in the past few years as well.
Sure.
Or even in the piece that I have coming out, I talk about the way that Jane Fonda was treated during her Fire Drill Fridays, when she would literally just stand on the steps of the same Capitol where these people are standing right now in your picture, and she would be arrested and zip tied. I remember she did this on her 80th birthday. I was there, and they arrested her, like that. And it's amazing and remarkable the ways that these people were treated when they actually came in, and there were smoke bombs and they were armed, and they were certainly not peaceful protesters.
No, it's incredible. So Steve Quilley has joined us. Are you in Waterloo, Steve, or where are you in the world? Are you?
I'm in bed.
Yeah. So you're pulling a John Lennon.
Well, yes, I don't think. I've got 4 kids, and we're homeschooled at the best of times. One of them's now in school, but this lockdown is catastrophic for everybody, and that even the homeschooling has completely changed. It's just destroyed them. So we're having all sorts of problems on that. With everybody online at home, me not being able to get into the office, the bed is the only place I can retreat to, and usually I have to share it with 2 dogs and a cat. But anyway, we're all good.
Are your kids still playing music in all of this? I just so everyone knows.
You know what they are, and we should be having. It should be the greatest opportunity. It's like all of us. We've got this lockdown, and we're saving 2 hours a day with commuting and shit like that. So so we should all be learning ancient Greek or doing the things that the edifying things that we've been putting off for years. But of course, actually, not being able to get out and not having any sense of time and wandering around in your pajamas, as anybody women who've had a baby, or men who've sort of been party to women having babies, as soon as you're under pressure, you end up being more productive than any time in your life. So when these external timetabling, scheduling pressures disappear, you end up, well, for me anyway, it's kind of totally destructive. But anyway, first world problem.
Yes, I know. And
I'm someone who earns a hefty wage from my bed. I'm not complaining.
I wanted to show here, this is one of the projects you've been involved with, which is the Ideological Conflict Project, which is one of the reasons I thought you would be great to have in here discussing this today, even though you're not near the DC area.
I'm not near the DC area. I wasn't essentially involved with that project. That was mostly Tad Home Dixon, but we've been in and out of it for nearly 10 years now.
And in a different context, though, your work has involved how people grapple with these grand transitions. I think societies, sectors of society, labor, these kinds of factions that we end up focusing on
I mean, I
when
think
we're in a period of disruption.
I only overheard the end of Dana's comments there, and I think Dana is kind of very concisely repeating the kind of talking points which have come through all the mainstream media and make some kind of sense, although I would challenge it on a number of levels. I think the reason the police were, I mean, okay, you take it as read any time there's political violence on that level that it's shocking and lamentable and is an index of a deep problem in a democracy. And I don't think just the American democracy, I think all of the Western democracies are in trouble in this way. So take that as read. And we probably share a view of Donald Trump or whatever. I'm not even going to get into that. But I think the contrast between who was it who was on the, you mentioned was on the step getting
Jane Fonda.
Oh, Jane Fonda, yeah.
I mean, the difference is very clear because America was on a knife edge, has been on a knife edge, whipped up by both sides for the last 2 months. And the police, I don't think that was anything to do with, differential, white privilege in relation to people or any of that nonsense. I don't think anything to do with that. It was on a knife edge, and they were really, really just trying to work out how to get through that day when both sides were when you've had a year. I mean, if you talk about consider this, that everybody on the right, who are people like us, warm-blooded hearts, normal human beings on the right, what's going through their feeds, their social media feeds, is the fact that we've had political violence on a scale unprecedented for a year in America, with nightly attacks on courthouses, with attacks on police, with attacks on institutions, and Democrat DAs. I'm just telling you what's going through their feeds. Democrat DAs have refused to prosecute thousands of people who, in normal circumstances, would be on charges which would land them with years in jail. So step back, what's going on in America, I think what's been going on in Britain in a very similar way since 2016, is the culmination of a process which has been going on for basically 20 years, perhaps longer, and it's a legitimation crisis. And it's a legitimation crisis in which the people who now control, not in a conspiratorial way, but control the airwaves, the kind of recruitment you get into the media, that you get into universities. Universities are incredibly partisan now. It's impossible to be a conservative student or a conservative faculty member in most North American universities. The atmosphere is incredibly hostile. There's almost zero diversity of perspective. There are policy statements. I've just been dealing with a couple which are coming through our department, which are contestable in so many ways, and yet people dare not even voice kind of opposition. So the institution, the universities, the media are owned basically by left liberal voices, which are recruiting, come from the major cities, are reproduced through the education system, and are very, very hooked into this kind of global economy. The kind of people who are losing in COVID and more generally against the backdrop of the Rust Belt are people in small businesses, people for whom the lockdown has been devastating because they're losing. I'm getting my 150 grand or whatever, on the back of the state. I carry on working. My sister, who runs a small brewery, it's curtains. When they say lockdown, that means she gets no income for another 6 months, right? Actually, they've already remortgaged the house. It's catastrophic. And if you look in Newcastle, all the people who voted for the Labour Party in Newcastle, where I come from in the northeast of England, Rust Belt, big industry, the central area of Jesmond, very affluent, people like me, service sector jobs, people who can work online, very progressive Labour Party. They've got it's a very white working class city. The leader of the Labour Party is a black woman, and she's a fantastic activist, but very much part of this woke kind of identity politics, very middle class Labour Party. All of the peripheral towns around the northeast voted Johnson for the first time in ever. Places like Blythe, I was there for 8 months this year, 2 miles up the road from us in Blythe, where I was in Cullercoats, Whitley Bay with my sister. People voted en masse for Boris Johnson, and that wasn't because they'd suddenly come around to loving, southern, poshly educated, ancient Greek-speaking, effete kind of Oxbridge, They've got no affiliation with those people, but they see the Labour Party, just as people in America see the Democrats, as being utterly, utterly, utterly hostile. And so if you want the roots of that legitimation crisis, I would put it back to the moment it coalesced was when Hillary Clinton called 50% of the American population a basket of deplorables, and then the left contested the election. The reason the right have been able to contest this election is because the left spent 4 years contesting an election on a bunch of stuff about Russia, which proved to be totally bogus. And then you've whatever you think of Trump, he won that election, and the electoral college works in a certain way. The left contested it. They tried to impeach. Instead of dealing with ordinary people's problems, they spent 4 years impeaching and going through all this process and turning up the ratchet on all kinds of stuff, which is to normal people is kind of just nonsensical and stupid. All of the debates about pronouns and trans, all of that kind of stuff. I'm not making any personal commitment either way on that, but they're looking at that and just thinking, what the hell is going on? And then you get the things like the Biden, the laptop and the very, very clear attempt by big tech, who are clearly, woke billionaires on the side of the Democrats in this election, trying to stop the New York Post pushing that link to that story and suppressing information. Now, this isn't the slant I'm giving you is not one that you're getting through your social media feeds, and it's also not one that anyone watching this is getting. That's the slant which every single one of those people is watching. And so instead of turning around and saying, oh my gosh, here's the far right fascism, blah, blah. I mean, that's so far from fascism, what was happening. It's just incoherent delegitimation, political violence, and sort of mutual disidentification. It set the scene for fascism, a fascism of the left or a fascism of the right. What's going on, and that might come in 5 or 10 years' time, what's going on at the moment is that America is split and that one side doesn't trust the other. So when you say, oh, look at the violence, they're saying, does she not been watching the TV for 9 months? Like, with all these firebombs going off in my city, like, what planet are they saying? What planets are they on? Just like you're saying to them, what planet are they on? And unless those two sides come, unless the project is about re-legitimation of American democracy, and that means that the American left have to compromise in order that the American right can cut off the most toxic bits of their own kind of following. Unless you get that.
It's a very interesting perspective. I just say that I actually study activism and protest on both sides, and I've been doing it for over 20 years. So I have a pretty good sense of the way that the whole thing's working here. But thank you for your perspective.
And Beth, I'd love it. I want to introduce Rod Schoonover in a second too, but I want to turn to Beth. If you're a conflict resolution frame and you know that you've got two factions in a room, let's suppose somehow we have some influencers related to these two visions of America here. This sounds like a very discouraging situation, right? Or not? Like it feels. If there's a completely different information bubble around these two factions, then that's a starting point that's so far from where you would need to be to have something come out the other end. It feels challenging.
Well, the good news is that we're hearing what's really going on for people, right? If it wasn't being expressed, then we'd have to guess at what it is. So if I want to put a positive spin on this, we can say, okay, people are being very outspoken about what they have to say, what they feel, what they think, and so on. Now, not necessarily doing it in the most constructive ways for all different parties. You have the mainstream, whatever that is, right? And you have people who want to go along and do things in a peaceful way, in an expressive way, in a constructive way. And then you have extremes on all ends who kind of ruin it for the people who are trying to be heard and trying to work things out in different ways. So one of the challenges, I think, is that people are so confused about the news and people are confused about information. We're inundated with so much information and repetitive broadcasts all the time. And then you have people saying fake news or things are not real. You really start to wonder what's real and what's not real. And then even if people were not conspiracy theorists, it's like, you almost can't help but buy into some of these conspiracy theories because they're just all over the airwaves. You just can't get away And then you get glued to the TV, you get glued to the news, and it just keeps repeating again and again, kind of like what happened with 9/11 when you kept seeing the towers falling repeatedly. So you're just being barraged with all this information. And I think we're losing sight of what is real for us, right? So we just think it's absolute real or absolute not real. But then we try to figure out, what does this mean to me? And that's where I think people are trying to internalize some of these messages to say, what does this mean to me and how is this affecting my day-to-day life? And remember that we talk about, forces at work and the perfect storm. We have this year of the pandemic with so many people suffering. We have years of, bashing each other without constructive dialogue happening. And so it just came to a head, I think, and is just exploding. The racial violence that happens in the US, and then the reaction to that with Black Lives Matter. And then you have the political discourse. Yeah, if you look at the footage and you look at what's happening, which is real, right? It's real footage. Now, maybe still only part of the story, but that footage is real. There is a disparity in how different groups have been responded to by what we call law enforcement. So
I don't buy that.
But Steve, before you went on for a little while there, and it was actually a very valuable articulation of what, and I want to emphasize the legitimacy of that reality that you described, because I have two sons. One is 30, lives in Los Angeles. He's a white privileged guy who, with his white privileged girlfriend, lives in downtown LA when the riotous part of the Black Lives Matters demonstrations happened for weeks in their neighborhood. He was completely, utterly captured by that one information flow. His girlfriend is more conservative. They ended up being radicalized to the right. This is my son. My younger son is a Bernie bro, at 22, who now is a Biden bro. So I've lived in this landscape of those two realities for the last year, and it's been a real tough learning experience for me.
Have a 30-year-old son.
But I'd like to get back to Dana a little bit on reflecting, on that, the point that Beth made about, to me, it's all like, okay, let's start where we are. Obviously, there's still dust in the air. It reminds me after 9/11, when I was reporting on 9/11, there's literally dust in the air, and no one knew what was going on. So here we are. There's a lot of dust in the air. There's a lot of noise. There are clear signals, as Beth described. And Rod Schoonover, an intelligence analyst for a couple of decades with a sustainability background, I'd love to hear from you on this too. Assessing where we are now, knowing our political landscape, what are some first steps toward some productive future? And Dana, just from your standpoint, I'd love to hear a little bit from you on that.
Well, one of the big things I think is worth noting is that we have been seeing this kind of insurgency happening across the country since April, in terms of thinking about, anti-lockdown protests, but then more recently we've seen, counter protests to Black Lives Matter, et cetera. We saw it all across the country. It's worth noting that on Wednesday, in addition to occupying the US Capitol, 14 states had similar types of protests happen at the same time, using very similar tactics. The problem is, at this point, right now, the US Capitol has reported that they arrested 12 people out of the hundreds who occupied the Capitol building, that led to 5 people being murdered. Or dying, actually, because they weren't all killed. Some had health-related problems. And that's a really interesting juxtaposition to the number of people who were arrested during peaceful protests during George Floyd. And I was at those events as well, watching the police response, watching the tactics that the police use. So the big problem right now is that all of those people were escorted off of the Capitol, and they went to places like the Trump Hotel and other places and actually went to the bar. And they're all
I saw some of that footage.
Yeah, and they're all reporting on Parler. They're coming back. They'll be back for the inauguration.
Yeah,
and
this is not over.
They're bringing weapons with them. And the problem is that until people who use aggressive tactics on both sides are treated the same way by law enforcement, this is going to continue. So I think that we need to be really careful about this. And there's been some interesting stuff tying the backgrounds of the people who work for the Capitol Police to people who were involved in organizing the protests on Wednesday. But the deal is that until there are repercussions and and these people are punished for their behavior, more people are going to come out who feel like they can behave this way.
Let's come to Rod. Rod, you and I have talked a lot on this show since early last year about planning and preparation and the lack of capacity for thinking strategically on long timescales. This is setting aside whether Trump stifled the Capitol Police or whatever. This seemed to me as so inevitable that the protection for the Capitol would be necessary at a higher scale. But you're in Washington now. You were posting tweets of stuff literally as this was unfolding. So first, just to remind everybody, you have a background in sustainability, science, ecosystem resilience.
Yeah.
You've been in national intelligence for a long time. And
now I'm not.
Where do we go from here? Yeah. Well, you left under the Trump administration when they tried to stifle your testimony. Yeah.
That's right. Well, thanks for having me on. It's good to see you again. I like these kinds of discussions quite a bit. I live in Washington. I live in Capitol Hill. I can walk out my door and see the Capitol. My daughter goes to the Hill preschool, which was shut under lockdown on Tuesday, and we had difficulty getting her out. These are for those of us who live in Washington, D.C. This was equally unsurprising and shocking. This is, in the intelligence community, we really we often looked at fragile states and failed states. And what are the indicators of these types of states? And countries that can't deal with their own domestic problems. That's one of the indicators. Protection of its own citizens, solving the problems of the populace. The United States has a number of these indicators. The exacerbant seems to be, and other people on this show are more expert than I am, but we have a real balkanization of information. I disagree in equating them. I think one set of information is more correct than the other. One tends to be a little bit, at times, even egregiously so, perpendicular to reality, and one is a little bit more reality based. I'm not saying that there aren't problems in both, but what we saw, on a couple days ago, was a conspiracy fueled, largely baseless assault on the transfer of power in a democracy. And yes, and one of the things that I think is really interesting is that we are so inured, we are so saturated with things that upset us, whether it's COVID, whether it's violence, whether it's shootings, that we can't see the horror for what it is when it's staring us right in the face. I mean, what would Jefferson or Washington or even Teddy Roosevelt think if they could peer in on what had happened? People violently taking over the Capitol, right? I think and this is something I've seen in climate change, circles, that, we don't want to sound alarmist. It's a self-tonal adjustment. We don't want to ring the bell because we don't want to sound less credible. We just need to be really factual. But what we saw was horrific. and we should call it out, what it was and what it means that our own citizens are willing to do things like that, and as Dana said, suffer little recourse. I come from a line of proud Native Americans who, had they done something like this, or other people of that kind of standing in our society, I believe the response would have been different. And just one last point. Surely people see the difference between marching in the streets and at times there being property damage and clashes, violent clashes, with an assault, with an attempted takeover of the seat of power of the United States.
There's a lot to absorb there, and that was a pretty powerful reflection on statehood and what are responsibilities that haven't really been lived up to so far, just in terms of basic public safety, in terms of what you said about tracking indicators of failed states and looking at where we are right now in the United States. One thing that comes clear here, and that came up in a comment just now, is the role of our new information system, which I stumbled into, early on at the Times, became a blogger, totally enthralled with our communication landscape. Connects anybody in the world, the noosphere, I was calling it. And now this downside, it feels like, in a way, what we've seen, is it unfair? And this, I go to Beth and Dana and then back to Steve, to look at this eruption that happened as an extreme event that is the first real powerful, Brexit, I guess, is another one, but we're in a world where extreme events are unfolding as a result of the way information flows have changed. And I don't know whether that's adequately understood yet. You're scholars all, and are we playing catch up here in a big way? So again, Beth and Dana, and then Steve.
So it is, I think it's hard to know. I asked myself that question too. Has this been going on for a long time and we didn't know about it in different locations because we didn't have the media and the instant information? We didn't have access to video. And now we do. Now we're inundated with so much information. I mentioned earlier, just hard to discern what does this mean. And when I think about failed states and I think about the insecurity of the institutions and the system, then everybody gets more anxious and everybody needs to take the law into their own hands. When you have a state that's not failed, which is what the United States is supposed to be, then you want to rely on the systems that are in place and the institutions and the procedures that we have. Although, as Rod mentioned, not everybody in this country has the same privilege towards those institutions and those protections. So what's interesting is that some of the things I did hear the other day was people said, this is not America, this is not the America I know, and other people said, this is the America, and this is the America I know. So there you have just blatant two different statements that reflect very different experiences of what it means to be a person in this country and what the whole idea of protest means. Who's being heard and who has the privilege to protest in a safe way. So I'll just turn that over to Dana.
Those are great points, Beth. I would just say that, I think, first and foremost, the remarkable differences in the way that peaceful protest was handled this summer, or even before this summer, because I've been out at all the protests since 2016, since the 2016 election, to collect data here in DC. So I have a pretty good sense of the way that the police have behaved and when there were tanks and when there weren't tanks called in. And it's remarkable when there were serious threats that were already known, given what everybody heard about the plans for these people to come to DC and violate, by the way, COVID rules as well, which was wonderful, and not wear masks and implement social distancing, even though that was required for their permit from the National Park Service. The last thing I would just say, going back to Andy's question, I think that it's absolutely necessary that we start thinking about the way that information is flowing through these different channels that do lead to echo chambers and have an effect on public attitudes, as well as policy making, as well as partisan distinctions across, parties, but also across, the polarized political world that we're living in now. And I think that we're woefully behind in understanding how that information diffuses and what it means and how it creates narratives. And, I actually started doing some of this work, but just really preliminarily around climate and climate misinformation. But there's no question that there's real need to do this kind of work around other types of information as we're seeing right now.
This really good question or observation was just posted by Vicky Robin. Who wins if we characterize the conflict as BLM versus Trumpism? What does what does a roaring stock market say about what is going on between the people of all races at the bottom suffering? Really interesting question. So Steve, again, back to you in terms of your reflection.
What can I say? I'm so despondent. I mean, if I can't even find any common ground, I honestly, Dana, with all due respect, your characterization is so ideological. I mean, the idea that, you mentioned the COVID restrictions, that they weren't enforcing COVID restrictions. For the last 9 months, on the right, they're looking at every single institution encouraging big BLM demonstrations where there's no COVID security at all, and the hypocrisy of that.
That's absolutely not true, and I've been at all of them, and I've been studying them across the States for the past 6 months.
We've watched dozens and dozens of demonstrations which are breaking the law in England and in University of Waterloo. They're encouraging people to protest en masse during the height of the COVID restrictions last time round.
That may not be the same as it is in the United States, but it's very different.
I think there, actually, Steve, I want to bring in one little observation based on social media and what flows. The media, the news media, and absolutely even more so, social media practitioners capturing imagery to suit an audience, amplify the outlying cases. So in all these instances, and again, that just takes me back to my experience with my son.
But that works on both sides.
I know. That's what I'm saying. It just, so Steve, your observation about you've seen unmasked, blah, blah, blah. There's no way to characterize that in terms of what actually was happening on the ground, unless
but
you're actually there.
Dana's using that as leverage in an ideological tussle between a sort of a left versus a kind of inverted commas right take on this situation.
I have random samples of data from protesters at all these protests, so it's not biased. Okay. And it's not ideologically driven.
I think the idea that the lack of COVID security on the other night compared with all of the Antifa BLM ones where there isn't the differential there. It's just okay. More generally, move on from that. I disagree with you on that. I think. I've already said, I think the reason the police screwed up the other night was because the thing had been so high. They were genuinely hoping that they could avoid. I just think it's nothing. On other situations, I think the general pattern that you're seeing from BLM Antifa is of Democratic DAs just refusing to prosecute people who have actively gone out for month on month, night on night, to destroy property, to intimidate, to harass, to march through neighborhoods, screaming in the middle of the night for attacks on law courts, and I think so. That's the general picture. I think in terms of what to do about it, the fact that all of the left are jumping on this bandwagon, this kind of show included, sadly, I think. I'm not. At least from my point of view. Tells me that we're just going to march in different directions. And yes, if it carries on like that, America will fall apart. I can't see any other way of accommodating it. And there was a great book written in the 50s by Leopold Kohl called The Breakdown of Nations, which kind of predicted this eventuality. But the fundamental reason is because unless you have a shared we, then you can't have a political community. And the left, there are some problems on the right, but the left academics on the left and left activists academics have for 20 years been actively destroying the we, which constitutes, however flawed in practice it is, you need that imagined community in order for to have any kind of chance of a political process. So when you get schools pulling down statues of Abraham Lincoln, or people calling for Mount Rushmore to be destroyed, or re-evaluating every single historical figure and pulling down every myth and knocking down every statue from roads in Britain, and you say there is no we. You're basically saying there can be no we, and then you're one is surprised when people say, hey, well, if there's no we, if there's no shared identity, most of the people on the right, what they're hearing from the left is kind of for 100 years they've thought they were playing a game called liberal individualist sort of meritocracy, where your chance to shine, and it's not perfect, and there are barriers, and gradually we're removing those. But if you look at the position of women, women are now outperforming men in just about every single department. I think there's only 1 or 2 disciplines in universities where there are more female graduates, more female PhDs across the line, and that's been a gradual increase. And it hasn't been because of sort of gerrymandered group politics of equality of outcome. It's been equality of opportunity, a whole bunch of changes in society, and women are doing really well, and men are actually doing very badly, young men in some situations, and needs to be corrected. If from that towards this kind of this game, which is called gerrymandered group politics, with or without violence, then you are licensing exactly the behavior that you saw the other night. That behavior is a response to the identity politics of the left. And so I would say the litmus for me about whether the left is serious, whether Biden is serious, whether Pelosi is serious, whether these people in the Democrat and the academics who are the cheerleaders for them are serious about reconciliation and constructing a view of society. I mean, the number of actual racist fascists in America is infinitesimally small. I mean, people call bloody Ben Shapiro a Nazi. He's Jewish. And some of the Proud Boys were wearing those anti-Semitic kind of Holocaust T-shirts. I mean, clearly they're being selected because they're wearing those T-shirts. They're a tiny, 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 tiny majority of the people. Most of those people are genuinely they're right-wing liberals, basically, who believe in a kind of society of individuals, which brings its own problems. And unless, if the left want to be serious about that, then they'd go and prosecute those people in Portland. If you want these guys prosecuted, then start with the ones in Portland. That was months ago. They haven't been prosecuted. Prosecute them. Be seen to prosecute them. And then people on the world will say, you want to prosecute the ones on the Capitol? No problem. You go for them. Let's stick to that one principle that breaking the law, you get prosecuted, but you have to prosecute them.
So Steve, we have to get toward the sort of resolution here, and you've made some important provocations and points, which I value greatly, and I think have to be dealt with somehow or other in our discourse going forward, whether it's in academia or in how Congress talks to itself, or in how people vote and try to build community. I want to turn it to Beth here because, again, AC4, I guess one of the theories here that I see in my liberal friends is that we have to look at this all in the frame of how America makes decisions, have legislative justice and stuff. And even on climate policy right now, there's a debate among well-meaning folks on the left. How much do we do aggressively right now in these first 100 days or the first year of the Biden administration? And this is a proxy on this kind of issue too. We've got the chance, we've got Senate, Congress, and how much do we work for a longer time scale? The full Biden administration, perhaps 8 years. So it's like there is that divide. And I think that relates to some of the points Steve was making. If it's strategic and based on our politics, there's a good argument to just drive in, do all the stuff you can do right now, knowing that 2022 Congress will flip the other way, the House. And so Dana, I want to get to Beth in first, and then you, and then Rod before we end. And I can go beyond 1 p.m. I don't want to, if anyone can go a little longer, that's fine with me. It'd be great. These are tough issues.
So 2 points I want to make. One is about, like in the world of conflict resolution, we talk about meta-narrative. So the we that Stephen was bringing up, that we don't have an agreement on we, and if there is no we, then what are we going towards? So sometimes people get caught up in their individual or small level goals. You have to go to that meta level, and I don't know how far up we have to go to get that meta level goal where there is a we. And the other part, I think, which really I know I find very frustrating, is the lack of accountability. And when I say accountability, I'm saying that if we have a representative government, I don't understand why our representatives and senators are not being held accountable to really represent us. And I feel that there is a lack of representation, and people get elected, they do what they're going to do, they say what they're going to say for an election. So people are very cynical about the political process. Then they go off and they're elected, and then they do what they do without really a lot of transparency. And if we are going to protest and let things be known, I mean, one of the positive things that came out of this whole election period, I think, was an increase in the number of registered voters, period. I didn't care who they were voting for, but this country doesn't really utilize our right to vote and have a voice in an electoral process. And so many times the percentages of turnout is so low. To me, that was a positive sign this past year, that whatever your motivation, you were motivated to get registered and vote. So we need to have a meta narrative where there is a we, so we can vote and push towards a collective organization, a collective country, a collective system. And then there needs to be more accountability all across the board.
And Dana?
Well, I think there are a lot of interesting points that have been raised. I mean, I would just build on this in terms of thinking about this notion of a collective we. I mean, one of the things that I document in my recent book, American Resistance, is the way that across a broad swath of the left as well as centrists in America, we saw a very strong we emergent that was pushing back against this notion of alternative facts, pushing back against the normalization of hate, pushing back against the notion that Americans should arm themselves and fight one another. And, you know, and it really has worked quite effectively by also working back down in the local level to mobilize people to participate in elections. And we've seen a remarkable increase in participation in both the 2018 midterm elections as well as in the 2020 election, as well as this Georgia runoff, which was just fascinating and remarkable.
Totally.
When you look at the youth vote, as well as you look at just registration overall. So I think we're seeing some we's emerging now. That does not address the hyperpolarization we have right now in our country, but the fact that we even see some components of society being able to work together is notable, and I think remarkable and worth celebrating.
And Rod, I'd like to get you in here too. You know,
Yeah.
We talked about leadership a few weeks ago, and what the Biden administration can do to better integrate knowledge in the context of risk reduction. And you know, looking at the political, social disruption, information risk, what comes to mind there is there was some really important points made here, both in the comments and in the discussion.
Well, it's a real challenge. I mean, because you know, we have an economic system that has worked for this country for a long time, and it's been very powerful. We have a very important set of freedoms in the Bill of Rights that must be protected. But we have poison in the system in terms of people not being able to tell correct from incorrect. There are, you know, we got rid of the fairness doctrine in the United States for argument. That was well before I was in government. Yeah. But it did lead to, among other things, this rise of highly opinionated information guised as news. And it's only worsened in the last 2 or 3 years. For the life of me, you know, when I worked for the intelligence community, we were not allowed to go on Facebook. It was seen as a danger to us. You know, it's for the life of me, I'm not even certain what value it adds anymore to society. But that's my own personal opinion. By the way, in the comments, the people talking about, this is very common. Steve's comments are very common in the Midwest. I'm from the Midwest. I grew up in Kansas. I'm proudly from a long line of farmers and construction workers. The thing that Midwesterners have is kindness in their soul, and in the amount, the expression of what I would say hate and venom that has come out, not just from a couple days ago, but in the last 3 or 4 years, I believe has been. I can't remember whether Dana or Beth mentioned it. It's radicalization that is happening. This is not the normal state of most Americans, or most people for that matter. One of the things that really gets to me is, I really appreciate Steve's comments, but it seems to be so fixated on left versus right and all of that. I don't know what left versus right sometimes means anymore, especially in the last 4 or 5 years. I don't know what the right believes in, especially. I think there's been some drift on the left, but on the right, it seems to be mostly about what they're aggrieved against. I don't really see myself, I see myself more of a scientist and more, pro-fact or anti-fact, but it seems to me that the right is defining itself as being against what the left believes in. I worked in the Trump administration, and I had a lot of really good interactions with people who, I didn't really agree with on a policy, platform. But, they were, a number of them were really well-meaning, competent. But over time, there was a shift. And there was, especially around 2017, 18, 19, sort of a meanness that started to creep into the policies of the United States. And so, there's a whole basket of things in what I just said, but I feel like this left versus right thing doesn't serve us anymore. It doesn't. I don't mean it as a coming together grand moment. I think it just doesn't really accurately describe what our politics or our social direction is in the for the past 5, 10 years.
So if anyone can stay on for a little bit of a concluding remark, that'd be wonderful. I want to interject. So this is something I've been doing on Sundays. My show revolves around music and the arts, and I'm going to play a song actually here. If I have this queued up correctly, you should hear it. This was Tom Chapin, who's a very liberal, folky from the Pete Seeger tradition, who was on here not long back, singing a song called "Come In, the Door Is Open." Hopefully I click the right buttons. We'll find out.
Come in, the
Can you hear
door
it?
is open.
Yes, no?
You are welcome here. Come in, the door is open. Leave out all doubt and fear. We'll plant a seed together, and together watch it grow, and learn once more what we already know. Lift up your voice, rejoice in what we've found. Let every heart take refuge in the sound. Feel the walls around us tremble. We will surely bring them down and find ourselves on common ground. Find ourselves on common ground. This is how we celebrate our song and dance and art. This is how we touch the future, how we touch your heart. Tell your story to a child and they'll take it as their own. This is how we learn we're not alone. Your voice, rejoice in what we found. Let every heart take refuge in the sound. Feel the walls around us tremble. We will surely bring them down and find ourselves on common ground. Find ourselves on common ground. Da, 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 da. I haven't played this in a while.
So that feels like it's highly relevant. And I think it gets at that idea we talked about a little earlier, which is figuring out how to create space for just exposure to the humanness across the aisle. It's going to be really tough, given where we are and given how these tools work. You know, we're in little boxes. It's hard to reach across a box. Steve, I think you said you had a brief final
just
thought.
Before
Again,
I go, so thank you,
yeah.
everyone. And I realize this is all very contentious and as usual, I'm in a healthy little vibrant minority corner of my own, but that's fine. I wanted to make the left-right thing. I completely agree with you. And the most interesting work on this is, for me, is the post-liberal kind of convergence. And I posted something there. I've been trying to point out to people on the Greens on the left that there's, if you're in, the real difference now is between, you know, somewhere and Goodhart, somewhere and anywhere, or somewhere and nowhere, and the left tends to be attached to the anywheres. They tend to be attached, whether they like it or not, to a neoliberal kind of globalist, open market, open borders. So there's actually much less space between the Koch brothers and Obama and Bush and Blair than there is between all of them and Trump, who's incoherent but a protectionist of sorts and challenging the kind of relationship with China, those kind of things. And so the localism, if you look at the localism, the kind of localism is used to dominate green politics, small is beautiful, Schumacher, you know, Wendell Berry, those people are also heroes for some people on the right. So the front porch Republic people. And for me, that's where the kind of, as a green, that's where the action is. It's a kind of localism. So that's the first thing. The second thing, on the press, I think you're completely underplaying the extent to which the universities and the mainstream media, the radicalization has started there. It started on campus. It started with all this kind of identity politics. And if you look now, they're eating themselves. So the New York Times couldn't even sustain Barry Weiss as a columnist, which is a shocking indictment of the biggest paper probably in the Western world, that they couldn't sustain one conservative. Suzanne Moore had to leave The Guardian because she's a left feminist of an incredible pedigree, an incredibly intelligent commentator, you know, the public sphere for 30 years, all the way through my kind of life as an intellectual. She's been there. And I often disagreed with her, often liked her, but I always read her stuff, and she's out of The Guardian because The Guardian is now run on a clickbait by a bunch of woke millennials who can't bear any divergent thought on the trans issue. That's happened again and again and again. And so I think if you're talking about, and it's happening in my university right now, you're not allowed to challenge these debates. It's not, so the radicalization started on campus. It started with the left, and only the left can fix it. You're going to get this response from the right all the time, unless the left reconciles itself to that older liberal community of individuals, basically, and forgets this group identity politics. And it seems to me that left isn't able to do that, which is why I'm immensely pessimistic. And by the way, your son, before I vote for Brexit, I'm on the fence about it. I was a Green. There are Green localist reasons for voting for Brexit. And there's a lot of very practical reasons for being incredibly pissed off with the European Commission. And the only argument I ever had with my Hungarian friends 20 years ago was about whether they should join the EU. And I said they shouldn't be included in the EU because the EU would fail if it went too wide and tried to do a single currency as well. And I'm now pro Brexit 100%. And one of the reasons I'm pro Brexit is because of the amount of bile which has been heaped on people in the north and people who are natural Labour voters by metropolitan liberal kind of university educated woke speaking people who dominate Radio 4, dominate The Guardian, dominate all the papers, including people like my this is just running a small brewery, or my brother-in-law who's a roofer. Like, these people they are absolutely not these kind of racist bigots that they're painted as. It's just not true. And yet that narrative comes through long and clear. So I think the left, don't ask for the America to heal itself. The left has to heal itself first. And the person I would get on is Ali Rothschild, because she's the one person from the left who I think probably, if the left did that, they should saint her, make her a saint, because I think she's just bloody marvelous. And also I think she's the one person who I think can act as an honest broker. She's one of the few people. The fact that I one is
okay.
A problem. Go on, I've got to go and do paternal things and organize children and things. So thank you very much for having me on, and I'm sorry to be as loud and obstreperous as I normally am. Much love.
You take care, and there's more to do. I can hear. I'll have to follow up on some of those people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
And that was Steve Quilley. He is deeply dug in on this and has some pretty powerful. He's like an uncorked bottle. I think some of that a bit long-winded, and that was a bit of a challenge.
And it's always the left that has to move, right?
I know. I'm not
always
into
the
this.
left.
I'm not into this idea of who went first. But those debates are really not useful. Yeah. But I think he's articulated some pretty important questions. As I said, with my two sons in my 2 ears, I feel that a lot these days. So just last reflections here. I do think we have a lot of work to do going forward. Dana, you're raising your finger.
Well,
you must feel a little.
I was raising my finger. Yeah. No. So I Well, I have to say, so I've done a lot of events since I started doing this research on the Black Lives Matter movement, or the protests since George Floyd was murdered, and I'm usually the only I'm usually the conservative. I'm usually the conservative on the panel. I've never been accused of being egregious against Christians, conservatives, and white men before, so that was kind of interesting and new. I would just say that, like, I'm going to do my plug for social science. So I'm a social scientist through and through. I'm very much, an empiricist. So I really don't think in left versus right as much as I think in data. And so the one thing I would say, and what I've really tried to do with my work, and when I do it across all sorts of protests of all sorts of people, although I can't go out when there are guns, and my IRB protocol won't allow me to go out when people aren't wearing masks either. But beyond that, I would just say that I think it's really important for us to use information and collect the information that we can from people so that we can learn from them. And that's what I've been trying to do. And I think that we know more now than we do before, but I think it's going to be a really important time to keep collecting that kind of information. Couldn't
agree more. Data matter. And by the way, I've had several sessions on here, a couple, that this still sounds self-serving perhaps, but there's such a deep underinvestment in basic science and the social sciences. It's like, just in the context of climate, Indra Overland came on. He had a paper out in January on what portion of climate science is about the social climate. And it's this tiny, tiny, tiny fraction. And when you think about the importance of that in building a better climate relationship, you realize that's a deep hole in the data and the understanding we need. And that doesn't even count the issue we're dealing with today, which is such a tough one. Beth, again, from the context of And thank you all again for being here today. This is a tough time.
So I agree that the right-left dichotomy doesn't work, because that's assuming that they're monoliths, and they're not. There's so much diversity inside of all of that it doesn't make sense anymore to have that paradigm.
Sure.
I think that people have to want to make a difference and want to do something different. And in order to do that, I think that there need to be some small wins, meaning some initiatives done to show good faith towards anybody and everybody, not one side versus another side. But once that starts to go, then I think it develops more goodwill and an intention of wanting to do the hard work that it's going to take to create that big meta narrative where we do feel like we, again, or if we ever did, but at least we have more of that feeling there, and going towards more constructive actions and outcomes.
And Rod, last thought here today. Thanks again for to all of you for being here.
Just to touch on maybe a few points from just as I jumped on. I was sitting in the CIA headquarters, 7th floor, in my office during the election of 2016 and through 2018. I think it's really important that some narratives do not get changed over time. The idea specifically that the Russian thing, the Russian involvement with the election in 2016 was a hoax, which is something that is being repackaged.
I've seen that.
We need to push people on the left and right, people, Republicans and Democrats, need to push back on this stream of disinformation. This is not something I can talk about, but anyone who thinks it's a hoax, they're gravely mistaken. And this is very important because it affects this entire discussion. Who do you think was the great beneficiary of this horrendous scene on the Capitol?
Absolutely.
Certainly other capitals were watching that with glee. In some ways, these outside folks lit a match, but to think that they're not still involved in polluting our information stream, and again, it is incorrect to equate the two information spheres. One is a lot more porous from outside influence than the other. For whatever reason, and that leads to my second point. I'm a physicist by training, and my time in government made me really value social science and how extremely important it is. When we were trying to really come to grips with influence operations, in the fog of confusion, the people who study computer science, the people who study all of that, they were the wrong people to help us understand what was happening. It was the sociologists and the information experts, the mass psychologists, and it's still an issue that I think deserves quite a bit of study. But this is kind of what you've been doing, Andy, with this program, really treating the information sphere as its own thing to address, and how and looking at its dynamics and its integrity. Our democracy, our institutions are being shaken because of reverberations, either natural or intentional, through this information stream. We are herd animals, and we are more influenced by what our fellow people say and do or think, than we like to give credit to. And so this is vitally important.
Yeah,
And thank you Beth, for having me.
I did point to that Haaretz article a minute ago that gets right into that issue. And I think I'm going to do a follow-up session on that, because, and just what you said about the dynamics and structures in the social environment on the right do seem to be more pliable for now. It's so weird to have Facebook turn off Trump after Facebook for 4 years basically built all of that reverberation sphere that
it's a good business model for them, right?
Yeah, basically. Well, again, thank you all for being here today. And I hope you think of this as an iterative conversation. I think there's lots to go forward on here on several threads, one of which for me, for sure, is the online environment, the online information environment. What can be done there? Are we stuck with this? And that relates so much to Beth's work on conflict resolution. Is hard enough to do sitting in a room, going for walks. I've looked at many models for how you do that. Figuring out how to do that online in a persistent pandemic is that much more challenging. Dana, your work, making sure there's data behind how we perceive events and having grounded observations directly in the field is a vital part of this too. So I appreciate your being here today, all of you. This is Sustain What adventure. Sustain What is a global online conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration. That's the last half century of our existence on this planet. We were in surge mode. The pandemic created a great pause. We're already kind of figuring out a path forward through that. A prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast forward information environment, the one Earth system changing faster than the actual environment. It's wondrous and fantastic. It's allowed us to convene today from our different places and have a conversation with people, as you saw, from Lusaka to Louisiana. But it's distractible. It's full of distraction, confusion, polarization. So lots of work to be done. This webcast is produced as part of my work building Columbia University's new Earth Institute initiative on communication and sustainability. Basically, how to make information and connectivity matter in pursuit of progress as opposed to regress. As soon as we're done, share the link you've been watching on with friends in circles far and wide. Get in touch with me with ideas. Look at that distracting scrolling bar below the screens we've been talking to you on for ways to do that. Thanks again to Beth, Dana, Rod, and Steve for being here today and offering a pretty stimulating and provocative and forward trajectory conversation on where we go from this extreme storm we've just experienced, and which may not be over. January 20th is still in the foreground. So you all again.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.